Dyne. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning, just for a few minutes to reflect together and tell you a bit of my own story. So just briefly, thanks to Nancy for coordinating, and Mark, and all the musicians, and all of you for being here, for making it possible for me to be here with you this morning. I know a lot of Fourth U from so many friends and colleagues from Union Seminary, and from the reputation that this place has as a place of metaphorical and literal sanctuary. I myself grew up in a different Unitarian Universalist church in Arlington, Virginia. So being in this space with you, even though it's my first time up here, has some elements that feel instantly familiar. The chalice, the hymns, something about this place and the people feels like coming home. I've been singing May Nothing Evil Cross This Door since I was 6. So it's a little bit like coming home. Since that time of my life, I've heard stories from people who find their way to Unitarian Universalist communities from other places. My own late mother's story, which I'll say more about in a minute, is one of those stories. And my story is maybe one of those stories too, except the place I left was my UU church, and the place I found my way to was the Episcopal Church, where I now worship. That makes it a little bit strange for me to be here. On the one hand, I'm not UU anymore. On the other hand, being here feels like coming home. As they say, some of my best friends are UUs. On the one hand, I have a lot at stake in the thriving of communities like this one. On the other hand, I don't know that there's very much I can tell you about how best to do that. What I can offer you this morning, I think, is a little bit of testimony, a little bit of my own story and reflection. My UU story starts with my mother. Mom grew up in northeast Oklahoma in a little town called Ramona. She and her family attended the local Baptist church. There are some great Baptist churches, some faithful and free ones, but this one, at least as my mother experienced it, was about social control. No drinking, no dancing, certainly no sex. So when she was 18, she graduated high school and spent the next year lacing boots in a factory that had a contract with the Air Force, and went to secretarial school at night. And she came east, where she worked up her way in the DC secretarial pool and ended up working in the White House, traveling the world. There was dancing, there was drinking, there was probably even sex. And there's one experience of hers in particular that I want to be sure to mention, because my mother, who had never been outside of northeast Oklahoma, ended up meeting David on a flight to Paris. David was the first openly gay person Mom had ever met, and he became her closest friend. This was in 1970 or so, toward the beginning of the modern movement for gay rights, and Mom and David were inseparable until he died of AIDS in 1991. She hadn't been to church since she was a teenager, but when my sister and I were born, she wanted us to grow up with something, so she looked at church after church and finally became part of the local Unitarian Universalist congregation. For Mom, it was important that she could choose what to believe, that she could make her own judgments about God. And she wanted those things for us, her children. I grew up in a household where choosing was simply my right as a human being. The thing that was great about our UU church growing up was the thing that was great about America, the freedom to choose. Now, I don't know if that story sounds familiar. I suspect for at least some of you it does. My mother wasn't the only person to end up in a UU church because she felt stifled or constrained by the place she was coming from. That's how my mother told the story. from oppression into freedom. What's unsaid, at least sometimes, of course, is that not everyone has the same freedom to choose. There is no UU church in the county where my mother's family still lives. When I drive home this afternoon to D.C., where my dad and stepmother live, I've got a set of choices about how fast to drive, or about what to say to a cop when I get pulled over. But not everybody has that same set of choices. When I go to visit Mexico, where I used to live, I can come back across the border with no trouble at all. My passport gives me that choice. In my job, in my church, I can meet privately with my boss. I can avoid harassment and abuse, and what I say will be believed. But not everybody has that same set of choices. So when I was a young adult of about 20, raised in a UU church, it was an act of UU piety, an act of making my search for truth and meaning a more responsible one, to notice the circumstances in which I had choices that other people didn't. I found that as a person decisively shaped by the white supremacy, the male supremacy, the straight supremacy of this society, that nothing I did could claim innocence. We don't have the hours it would take to narrate every twist and turn of my journey from being a Unitarian Universalist to being a Christian, but it starts there, with a growing awareness as a young adult of violence, racism, economic and sexual exploitation, a growing consciousness of what I now call sin, and of the ways in which it pervades everything, even me. Now, the point isn't that my path is one that other people should necessarily follow. The point certainly isn't that other people should go out and become Christian or an Episcopalian. We've got our own problems, God knows, and some of you probably know too. The point is that if we're serious about the responsible search for truth and meaning, if we're serious about the worth and dignity of every person, if we're serious about our interconnectedness, and those are things that my UU church taught me, that I take with me wherever I go, if we're serious about those things, then we may have to rethink our freedom to choose. If we share a vision of a world in which Black lives matter, in which everyone has the resources they need, in which everyone is free from violence, harassment, and abuse, and the richness of every gender and sexuality may express itself as it will, then I wonder if we have to call into question the most UU thing of all, the right to absolute self-determination. To even say that feels a little bit funny. It feels vaguely like a betrayal of my mother, who left rural Oklahoma to determine her own course and who worked at her job and at her church until she died, so that we, her children, could have that freedom to choose. That story of going from constraint to freedom is a story we tell ourselves over and over again about what has made America great. And it's the same story that I think we hear and tell about what has made Unitarian Universalism great. And I wonder if the similarity between what makes America great and what makes Unitarian Universalism great should maybe give us a moment of pause. I remember a classmate of mine, a Black woman, saying to me, "Your freedom isn't for me. The thing I, Benjamin, recognize as freedom isn't for her as a black woman. Not, I'm not free. Not, that freedom sounds good and I want some, but there's something wrong with your idea of freedom. What she meant was that my freedom to enter into conversations on my terms came at the expense of other people's ability to enter conversations on their terms. Your idea of freedom, she was saying, is about freedom of action, but not about who you're responsible to. About what you choose to do, but not about who those choices affect. She was questioning who my idea of freedom was for. Freedom meant freedom to have slaves before it meant freedom for slaves. And that was convicting for me. As a person who thought that freedom of choice in every part of life was not only my right as a human being, but an absolute good. So we can, and we should, denounce every attempt to dismantle the social safety net, to take away people's health care. We can, and we should, deplore deportations and mass incarceration. But what exactly makes the walls that we build to guard our autonomy that different from the ones planned for the southern border or the walls of prisons? In the end, what makes our idea of freedom and the choices we ought to be able to have so different from the one peddled as making America great again? So maybe the question now is not whose authority can we escape from, but who else can we make ourselves accountable, responsive, responsible to? Now, I don't want to pretend this is always easy. There are times when being accountable to other people, listening to them, operating on the basis of being in this together with them, can seem like an overwhelming, bitter burden. An infringement on our ability to, damn it, decide for ourselves. Everything in our politics, our culture, tells us that a person's freedom is found in escaping one another. That making ourselves great or great again relies on drawing people out of the circle. If I buy myself the apartment in the right building, if I keep the wrong people out of my country, if there is a business or a book or a Fifth Avenue tower with my name on it, then I can finally be happy and free. If I can build a concrete wall against my Mexican neighbor, or a theological wall against heretics, or a church wall, that one, right there, against people too different from me, then salvation can finally be mine. The truth is, there are lots of people we are not accountable to. Whether it's those in our churches, or those whose land our church is built on, or those whose labor, paid and unpaid, makes our lives and livelihoods possible. Even my own mother's story, as we heard it growing up, is a version of that story. There were parts of her life, of her church growing up, of the place where she came from, the people around her that she needed to escape from. If I can have a church, she must have thought, where no one is telling me what to do, then I can finally be saved from hell. And hell really is other people. But I think, looking back, my mother's classic UU story of escaping the authoritarianism of her Baptist church growing up and finding the freedom of her UU church, I think there's another way to tell that story. The choice of a UU church was only partially about escaping authority. I think it was also an act of accountability to her friend David, of choosing to be in a place that would see him in his full humanity, of being convinced that a place that wouldn't see that wasn't worth her investment of time and money and faith. She made his life, and not just her own. His life, and not just her own, a central criterion for who she was and how she would make her way in the world. So for me, an important part of my own journey into Christian life has been recognizing more and more the ways in which choosing to let other people choose is part of how I and the people I love get saved. But it's the values I learned in my UU church growing up that made me take that interconnectedness seriously. The seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism has driven me there. And I don't think anybody has to be a Christian to take that seriously. As a parent, I'm deeply interconnected with my children, Simon and Oscar. And by accepting that responsibility of parenthood, I have committed myself to limiting my own choices. I can't just move to a different city or take just any job or do whatever I want on a Saturday night, because the ways in which those choices affect Simon and Oscar and their mother, Melissa, are really clear. But the UU seventh principle, the deep interconnectedness of all things, pushes me to extend the boundaries of those vows. This isn't an abstract affirmation that we need one another. It takes particular shapes in particular times and places. It'll look different on the Upper West Side than it will for me in Harlem, much less for my family in Oklahoma. It means for me that in my work for peace with justice, my desire to be the hero or the savior must be constrained. It means as a white person following the lead of people of color. It means as a straight person following the lead of gay and lesbian folks. It means as a person who's never experienced any disconnect between the sex assigned to me at birth and the gender I perceive myself to be. As a cisgender person, it means I have to follow the lead of my transgender comrades. It affects, in my own case as a man, something as basic as walking down the street. If I focus on my right to do what I want in a public space, then I will walk as close and as fast as I want. But if I am focused instead on the ways that my white male body acts in a public space, in this society, in this time, and this place, the way that even the presence of a body like mine can threaten violence by its footsteps behind someone else. If that's what I'm paying attention to, then I might not walk so fast or so close. Because the freedom of the woman walking in front of me to walk down the street in safety also matters. Not just out of respect for them, but because there are parts of my own freedom that I can't get to otherwise. It can sound very dour, but I think many of us have experienced that it's not. The ways in which I'm accountable to my partner or children, the ways in which my mother was accountable to David, these are not things that we experience as burdens, but as divinely given sources of delight, where the circle of friends drawn together by both of us is richer than either of its circles by itself, where my young children are more alive for all the difference and disagreement between his parents and many godparents, when worship is richer, freer, holier, because it's all not just about what I need, when it's not about who we escape from, but who we let come with us, and who we let take us with them. Many of us, in other words, already have circles of accountability with joy. As a person who is no longer UU, but loves the UU world and cherishes what it gave to me, that is my hope for what Unitarian Universalist communities can be and can help me bring wherever I go. The hope to draw that circle wider. Maybe the ways in which we are accountable to our neighbors who are immigrants, who are felons, who are poor, who are Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or nothing at all. The ways in which we're accountable even to our fellow members of this congregation who have different priorities and different hopes. Maybe those can be great joys too. And that, I think, is good news for Christians, for Unitarian Universalists, for Muslims and Jews, for those who proclaim the holy by whatever name or by none. There is a new world coming, and it depends not on what I do, or what you do, or what they out there do, but on what we do together. Amen.